So one of the um, points on which I felt your book was lacking, although it was overall very good,
Mm.
was why things really start to change so dramatically around 2012 when what we call the Great Awakening began. Uh, do you want to explain why it took another few decades, or at least 2 decades from the early 1990s, for the Great Awakening to arise?
Yeah, I mean, I don't focus on that too much because one thing I do say is that, like, I think that a lot of the things that people think are new from the Great Awakening are not that new. Like, when I wrote this book, I was surprised that people treated stuff like, oh, standardized tests are racist. Like, when I see that and like people treat this like, I'm like surprised that people are still shocked by this because there's lawsuits in the 1970s
Mm.
over this, right? And like people just still think it's a new thing. So part of it is like a lot of this stuff is superficial. You look at what like Ibrahim Kendi wants and like his ideas, everything that has a disparity is racist. People treat that as some new development. It's not, right? So part of it is like maybe we've been exaggerating a little bit how much changed with the Great Awakening. Now I think some things have changed. Obviously, the culture does shift. I really like the I think the Twitter explanation is probably the best one. I mean, Twitter really takes off around 2011. It lines up pretty nicely with the Great Awakening. Now, David Rosado has some analysis where he shows that it takes off it takes off in all these countries, maybe even before the U.S. or around the same time as the
Mm.
U.S.
Mm.
I don't know. I'd like to see more confirmation of that. That's a very interesting theory. So there might be something else going on. I don't I don't know. Scott Alexander has a good post. I forget what it's called, but it's about the sort of he saw the Tumblr wars come into like the government in real time. So he saw like these discussions these crazy women were having on Tumblr, and then it went to like government policy during the Obama administration. Um, but yeah, I mean that's not completely satisfying because well maybe it is satisfying because you really have the internet taking off, and maybe it was just the internet. I mean, maybe it was really just social media influencing people. I don't know. I mean, I do think I remember on the the Floyd riots. I remember the first one of these was the Trayvon Martin
Mm.
case. I don't. This was shocking at the time. This was like I was in law school at the time, and the ACLU was gonna like have a protest in favor of like charging Zimmerman or like defending Trayvon Martin, and this was still shocking at the time. Somebody, it became like sort of we have like an email chain for like the entire law school. And one guy actually is like, "What's the ACLU doing?" Now nobody would be surprised by the ACLU doing this today. For a while, you had this guy Sean King on Twitter. I don't know if he's even still there, or he blocked me, or I blocked him. I don't know. I don't see him anymore. But he would just like take videos, and there would be like a black man fighting with a police officer, and he'd just like tell the narrative. Oh, this black man was just walking his dog, and the police started beating him. And you don't know what happened, right? And like these videos, like we started having like cheap phones where everyone was being video all the time, and like because liberals were in control of Twitter, and like people were sort of they were still sort of naive. They didn't see how like this stuff was BS over and over again. It would lead to like craziness and the cities would burn down. Now you have a few things. You have like, you have the biggest thing is Musk buying Twitter. And then you have just people like sort of, they've seen how often this stuff is BS and how dangerous this stuff is. And so like, we're not seeing as many, riots, who knows, it's only been, 3 years. But at least since Floyd, we haven't seen another situation like that. While before it was like every 2 years, it was like we had a decade where like every 2, 3 years, the American cities would erupt. Now they would interrupt. Now they did erupt in the 1960s and 1970s too over the same things like
Mm.
encounters between black men and the police. So it's hard to like explain all of this. It's hard to explain everything. You just try to do what you can.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a good article. I think it was by Musa Al Ghabi, in
Hmm.
which he traced the intellectual origins of various key woke concepts, and consistent with what you were saying, uh, identifies their origins in obscure academic books from the 70s and 80s. So, as you say, a lot of this stuff isn't particularly new. However, I do think that there's an unambiguous inflection point around 2012, which is visible, of course, in the in
Hmm.
the in the in the Goldberg Rosado hockey stick curve of
Yeah, yeah,
mentions of woke
yeah. That's right.
terms.
It's called the origins of woke, not all the developments of woke up until the present day. So yeah, you could write a whole book on just what happened
But I
around
mean, from a
when
from a
woke up.
social science standpoint, someone in your position does need to at least consider that point, because from a causality perspective, if the main thing that people notice that you want to explain comes 2 decades after the the proposed explanation, that someone might not be satisfied.
Yeah. Although, I mean, I don't think, well, again, I mean, um, I think that we were woke in 2005. We just didn't have Ibram Kendi, shoved in our faces to the same extent, right? I mean, we still had like, corporate America was, sort of the zero tolerance policy, the joke about how like, you could see the jokes in like Saturday Night Live in the 1990s and 2000s. Like, oh, is it sexual harassment if you're handsome? You probably seen that skit. Or if you haven't, like, it's like a sexual harassment video. The guy hits on a woman. She says, "Get away from me." But then the other one, it's not sexual harassment. What's the difference? Oh, this guy's handsome. Like, so this was like in the mid 2000s. This was like understood that this is how, this is how corporate America was. And this was because of the laws. So yeah, I mean, there was a cultural shift, but also at the same time, like, you can't, you've had to racial balance and be, walk on eggshells in this country in all kinds of different contexts for a very long time.
But I mean, there's various other indicators that seem to shift abruptly around 2012, like the attitudes to the reason for the black-white disparity among white Democrats suddenly become substantially shifted in toward the it's the fault of discrimination end of the scale. As I think
Yeah.
Zach Goldberg has documented, then there's the speaker disinvitations at colleges and cancellations or attempted cancellations of people in general. I mean, I think cancel culture really explodes
Yeah.
around 2012, and even more so in the late 2010s. And those developments do seem to require a quite substantial explanation.
Yeah. No, I don't disagree with you. I think, it's there. It's important. I wish somebody would write I wish somebody would write an entire book on what happened around, we're explaining the Great Awakening. I think we have a, an under sort of, we have a, the market needs more, like social science, good causal explanation for these things.
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly that you're correct that law is crucial and almost certainly a necessary condition
Yeah,
for.
although you could the a lot of the campus culture around rape and the trans stuff, that's actually, you could probably make like a mini case that's actually in law. A lot of these statistics that said 25% of women are being sexually assaulted in college or whatever, they came from like the government commissioning surveys, staffing it with these I tell the story in the book, staffing it with these feminists and left wing ideologues. The government goes and tells like universities, you have to have more Title IX coordinators. You have to do X, Y, Z. And we have this crazy panic about, rape, and, sexual assault and patriarchy. So, even there's like there is a legal explanation for that aspect of it.
Yeah, there was a letter, dear colleague letter sent. Was it 2011?
There were several dear colleagues
Right.
letter sent around that time, and yeah, they had a major impact. I mean, you could see the staffing of the bureaucracy. There were stories on this, and like, the campus rape tribunals, we didn't have them in the 2000s, and we didn't have them during the Trump administration either, because the Trump administration
Yeah.
withdrew those things. So it's like clearly like sort of it changed how young people have sex. I mean, there was a reign of terror there for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of explaining the explosion around 2012 that occurred in the context of a civil rights regime that had built up over several previous decades, that Twitter, social media must be
Yeah.
a central
And now you're
part of
seeing in
that.
the other direction too, with the conservative boycotts, all these stories about conservative
Mm.
boycotts starting to work. So you see, Twitter, I don't think you could, I don't know, I'm addicted to it. I think you're probably addicted to it too. I mean, I'm on it an ungodly amount of time. So whatever's happening on Twitter is influencing my brain. I think a lot of journalists and activists and young people are the same way.